were there to be a scenario where the honeymoon period of the Russian economy, which is growing exponentially well at the moment, it's shown resilience to the sanctions, at least because of the, as you said, investment in the military. But that's not sustainable, and ultimately that doesn't yield the sort of longer term benefits. It doesn't have a spillover effect. It doesn't spill over into other industries that can benefit it from very well.
The best thing that a Russian person can do if they're unhappy with their government is leave Russia if they can. These are a fractured people unified by a language that was forced on them. A lot of their own unique cultural identity has been erased. Will it ever get better? And you can look at the demographics and the answer is no. Based on the birth rates, the declining population, and now this stupid war wiping out an entire young generation of men, in equal number fleeing, going to Turkey and Thailand and the UK if they can get in. It's going to be horrific, this slow motion car crash.
This is The Global Gambit.
How you going, everybody? It is a time, well, it is Ukraine time, probably the main thing we cover on the channel. And there's a lot happening. Not needless to say, the events on November 7th, but this conversation will be split in two. One more on the ground, so to speak, of Ukraine and the developments amongst Kursk and with Russia. And then the second part, Trump and the foreign policy diplomatic side. And who better than to talk about both sides of this than the one only, it's Jake Bro, who we've had on the show before. I've been lucky enough to join him for some of his live streams. And I'm very delighted to have him back to talk with him through, well, a very, I think, potentially difficult but also unpredictable time in the future for Ukraine for the rest of the year and into early next year as we see Trump inaugurated and so on. But Jake, it's lovely to see you. How are you feeling at the moment, given everything that's going on?
I'm doing fantastic, Pyotr. In my personal life, I can't complain. Obviously, with the direction of my country, I'm a little uneasy at the moment, but it's a wait-and-see policy for everyone. We're going to find out together what the world's going to look like after January 20th.
Yes, that's certainly more upbeat than I was expecting initially, but that collective security thing I think is very good. And as we were both discussing off air, actually, if people, X is going in one way, but Blue Sky seems to be a place. So if people are interested in looking up what you do, what we talk about in a sort of more written format, then Blue Sky seems to be that. It's a little bit of a shout out to what you're doing there as well. But I think the first thing I really want to just break down is it's day 995 at the time of recording. Obviously, the main thing on the military front has been the developments in Kursk. The Ukrainians saying that they're now facing upwards of 50,000 troops on the Russian side. So what are you seeing on the ground at the moment, and how are you feeling about that situation?
So the Ukrainians went into Kursk months ago. I think this was back in August, so they've been there almost 3 months now. And for Putin, he gave them a hard deadline, expel all of these Ukrainian forces on our sovereign territory by the November election. That was the initial deadline. And obviously, Russia failed to do that. So now Putin has moved the goalpost again, and the new hard deadline for his generals to expel all Ukrainian forces is January 20th. On the campaign trail, Trump was saying he could end the war within 24 hours after being elected, just being president-elect. Nobody believed him, but he said it. And now the deadline is January 20th. I truly believe Trump doesn't have a plan. He never had a plan. He's making the plan now. He's got concepts of a plan, but for 60 days, he's talking to people, actual security experts. They're coming up with a plan. And Putin, under no circumstances, wants to negotiate with this chunk of territory inside of Russia still being controlled by Ukraine. So they are aggressively sending in small man units. They're also losing a lot of armored vehicles. But it's just every 15 to 20 minutes, send the next group of 4 guys, 8 guys, charge, die. The casualty rate for the Russians is going insane, losing more than 1,500 soldiers a day. How effective is it? I argue these are favorable terms for Ukraine. If you're fighting a war of attrition, you need to outratio your enemy. And if the Russians want to gift Ukraine all of these losses out of desperation on an artificial timeline, just take it. This isn't territory Ukraine wants to keep anyways. This isn't territory that Ukraine cares about. So all of these defensive positions, let them charge. If you run out of ammunition, fall back, 200 meters or whatever to the next defensive position, and then start laying down landmines. Put as many landmines as you can get into Kursk, because you're never coming back. This isn't your country. The Russians did this in Kharkiv. It's the exact same thing. Landmines and FPVs, they're doing a lot of damage right now in Kursk.
So one of the things that I really, really enjoyed, some contacts of mine, and then it was verified from some other newspapers, was that the North Koreans, I'm very curious for your perspective of what the DPRK is providing in any success at all. But because the North Korean soldiers had never really had access to the internet before, they were more distracted by going on to, shall we say, some more delicate parts, promiscuous parts of the internet, engorging themselves on those enjoyable experiences, pleasures. That aside, what do you think about the North Korean element in this? Have they really made a sizable impact yet, or is it still too early to tell?
No impact, other than maybe a small boost for morale for Russian forces and to give the Russian people hope that they're not standing alone. I have a unique experience because I lived in South Korea for 6 years. I lived there as an English teacher in a public school prior to joining the Air Force. So I've talked to a lot of South Koreans about the aspect and relations with the North Koreans. I've read some books, I've watched some movies and documentaries, and I'm convinced that these 10,000 North Korean soldiers, they're never returning. They're never going to be allowed to return home to the Hermit Kingdom. In North Korea, this is the closest we've ever come to achieving a true Orwellian state. Your thoughts and actions in North Korea are completely controlled by the Kim regime. They changed their language, just like the Ministry of Truth in 1984. They changed their language to prevent thought of rebellion or ever imagining a world without Kim Jong-un as the living God. Kim Il-sung is the eternal God, the founder of North Korea. So we are getting more information as some of these reports come out in Kursk of what the North Koreans think and say and are doing. And apparently all these North Koreans were volunteers. I assumed that the Kim regime would just pick people they didn't care about. But apparently these 10,000 or so, they were asked and they volunteered to go. Now, I'm convinced they were never told you're not going to be allowed to come back. But this was a one-way ticket. They are being given favorable treatments. This went viral of these cans of dog meat. This is not dog food for dogs. This is food made of dogs for human consumption. And this is an honor. This is a treat for these soldiers to get it. So a lot of these North Koreans trying to make friends with their new Russian allies were sharing the canned dog, and these Russian soldiers can't speak Korean, so they didn't understand what they were being fed. But as far as the optics, this is propaganda. 10,000 soldiers is a week and a half of casualties for the Russians, so on the battlefield, this doesn't solve their manning problem because of the cultural and the language barriers. These men have proven dangerous to the Russians as much as the Ukrainians. The North Koreans can't tell the difference between Ukrainians and Russians, and they just fire on anyone that doesn't look Korean to them. So I'm convinced North Korea is not really fully committed to this war. If they were, they would have announced to their nation what was happening. The only information you get is from state media in North Korea. And North Korean state media has yet to announce or mention that North Korean forces are now participating in this war between Russia and Ukraine. So this shows me they're not fully committed. Kim Jong-un is just running a test experiment. He wants to see how some of his troops, the ones who volunteered, they weren't forced apparently. He wants to see how these guys perform. And so far, no impact.
Yeah, I think you could argue it's the first real bit of battle tests that the Koreans have had since even the Korean War, right, in 51, 52, I think some people have said. And we had one gentleman, Ankit Panda, who's part of the Carnegie Endowment for Peace, who's very well knowledgeable of North Korea. And he was saying that this is a huge test of also sort of loyalty to the Kim dynasty. I mean, I don't think they're going to come back because they're sort of well, they're no longer pure. They've been tainted. They've been affected by the sort of impurities of the outside world or something like that. So maybe these people chose to do so because they wanted to get
North Korean state media.
Go on.
North Korean state media tells their people they live in a workers' utopia. They say that North Korea is the happiest, most prosperous country in the world. And the only reason why everyone in North Korea tolerates it or puts up with it is because they're told everyone living in the South is living worse under the oppressive colonial rule of those evil American bastards. So that's what everyone has been raised to believe their entire lives in North Korea. No information gets in, no information gets out. These North Koreans are getting on their phones. They're seeing pictures of South Korea. They're seeing YouTube videos of the South Korean president speaking to them. And they now have information they're not allowed to have. So in my opinion, they're never going home. They're never seeing their families again. They're going to die in Russia at some point.
Yeah, it's like the Olympians, those the representatives of the Olympic team for North Korea were sort of reprimanded for, I think it was having a hug with their South Korean counterparts in Paris. But building on this,
taking a selfie,
having a selfie together. But building on this, though, because in summer we reported on this as well on the channel, Putin obviously agreed this strategic partnership when he went to Pyongyang. And he signed that into law, I believe, a week ago, so on the 9th of November. And that's, that includes a mutual defense provision. So I'm a little bit interested for your perspective on what exactly is the Kremlin giving North Korean exchange? Is it mainly technology, missile intelligence, helping them refine their nuclear capabilities? What exactly is Pyongyang getting in return?
Hard currency, gold bricks. Yes, Russia is giving them technology. They're helping them build a nuclear-powered submarine. They also launched a spy satellite for them. And they're giving them money. So a contract soldier for the Russian military is paid about $2,000 a month, sending 10,000 grunts to help Putin with his war. These North Korean soldiers aren't seeing any of this money. Their families back in North Korea aren't seeing any of this money. Kim Jong-un is getting the money. So 2,000 times 10,000 is about $20 million a month. $20 million a month is nothing to Vladimir Putin, potentially the world's richest man. But to Kim Jong-un, that's a lot of Kobe steaks. That's a lot of, cognac and truffles and all the other luxuries that he enjoys. So all Kim Jong-un has to do is give up 10,000 of his slaves and he can start earning $20 million a month. What dictator wouldn't take that trade if they're the most sanctioned country in the world and also one of the poorest?
Yeah, and I was waiting to see what analogy you would come out there, and Kobe steaks and cognac is certainly one I think he would enjoy. Maybe a better hair barber, but that's a joke that's been said too many times. Okay, so coming back to maybe more the Ukrainian side in this, because a few days ago, I think Ukraine launched its largest ever drone attack into Moscow. And obviously this has been a reoccurring concern for certain Western leaders, that this is a provocation that will lead to huge repercussions from the Kremlin, which never seem to really come to fruition. So what do you make of the Ukrainians, shall we say, incursions using drones and other hybrid means?
Everything that's a valid military target should be targeted so that every place in Russia has to take precautions. You don't want to be predictable. You want to be unpredictable. And Ukraine doesn't want to hurt the civilian population of Russia. That's not their goal. That's the Russians' goal. But Ukraine is actually trying to win this war. So by going after oil refineries and oil depots, this hurts Russia's money supply. This is their bloodline for feeding their military. Those are valid military targets. They started going after the alcohol distilleries because you need, ethanol for certain production of explosives. They've gone after military academies. They've gone after drone facilities and just spread it out. I don't know how many of these drones Ukraine can make every month. I hope they can increase production, but with what the limited supply they have, Yeah, just make everything feel like it's a target. So they have to worry about it. They have to think about it. They have to take anti-drone measures, air defense systems, electronic warfare, whatever.
But do you not think to be the go on.
Russia needs to feel the consequences. The ruling elites, the top 10%, they have to at some point realize that Putin is never going to achieve his objectives. He's never going to be the ultimate strongman that he's been selling this to the people, that I am untouchable, I never lose, all I do is win, win, win. It's been 3 years, and this has been embarrassing for, in my opinion, it's been embarrassing for Putin.
But has it? To be devil's advocate, Jake, he just held the BRICS Summit, and we cover that a lot on this channel, and I know you're going to give me a good pushback, but that was not a validation of Russia very much being in the international sphere, at least not in the Western sphere, but a bunch of leaders that didn't go to I'll rephrase it. Antonio Guterres, right? The Secretary General of the United Nations, shook hands with Putin. He didn't even go to the peace summit that was arranged by Kiev and Zelensky. What does that tell you? Why is he doing that?
Can you call it a BRICS Summit without the B? Lulu of Brazil claimed he slipped in the bathtub and that's why he couldn't attend the summit. There were a lot of people looking for any excuse not to go. You are correct. The UN Secretary General went, and we can be honest in that the UN has been compromised. I don't know what percentage of the world's population live in authoritarian regimes, but it could be a majority now. Mm-hmm. So for the UN, which is a global, I don't want to say governance body, but a cooperation body, if you want access to the people of China for humanitarian purposes or international organizations in cooperation, then you can't be in any way threatening to these dictators. This is going to be a controversial opinion I make, but authoritarians and dictatorships are legitimate forms of government. When the people vote for it or don't oppose it, I mean, are the people of China happy having no human rights or say in their government whatsoever? And there's 1.3 billion people in China. They've had every opportunity to rebel. We had Tiananmen Square, but basically nothing since. I mean, the Hong Kong protests, but Hong Kong is basically given up. So for the UN, I wish it was about promoting democracy and promoting human rights. And maybe that was the goal after World War II when it was founded. But that's not the goal today. It's about getting along and minimizing the damage and doing the help you can where you can. So that's one case why the UN Secretary General went to the BRICS Summit. The other one is money. These authoritarians have money, and they're now the ones who are primarily supporting these international organizations that cooperate with the UN. The United States says, especially under Trump, we don't want to pay for anything. The Europeans pay for stuff. I'm not minimizing their contributions, but a greater and greater share of the money for these international organizations is coming from places like Saudi Arabia and China and these authoritarian countries. So the UN Secretary General just has to get along to go along. I understand it. So in my opinion, it's a non-story. We don't really have to talk about it. He can do whatever he wants. But concerning BRICS, this is not the future. If the members of BRICS can never agree on a common currency, then it's not a real trade organization in that it's not going to replace the dollar. It's not going to bring down the U.S. economy. If they want to have free trade, fair trade, cooperation, whatever, we can be honest what BRICS is. It's a China-led alliance based on Chinese subsidies. If the Chinese economy ever starts declining or they can't afford these subsidies and projects, then BRICS doesn't actually mean anything. I hope they succeed. If countries become more economically prosperous and efficient, this helps the global economy. This helps me in America. Nobody should be opposing BRICS, and we shouldn't be viewing it as a threat. It isn't. It sounds scary, but it's really not.
No, I think BRICS is very much something people hear it, and it's more of a symbolism of what people, I think, want to happen, which is greater diversification and less weaponization of the dollar. I think I certainly think of it as China and Co., not BRICS, or in this case, RICS, because Brazil wasn't there. I think that's a very important point. And also to your point about, it's an important one, that people have this desire. Democracy is more free, but it gives you more economic fluctuations, right? You get booms and busts, whilst if it's autocratic, there's much more of an economic certainty, but you have less freedom. And it's that trade-off. Which one do you want more? But to bring it more to the military front again, I guess, do you not think, though, that Ukraine, even though it is holding its own in its respective lines, diversifying itself or spreading itself too thinly is risky? Right, the Russians are, whether or not you call it effective military management, are making incremental gains towards Pokrovsk, and generally they're moving, right? They're moving in a way that the Ukrainians haven't on the line of contact. And by trying to target strategic sites within Russia or focusing on Kursk, this is dividing the attention of Kiev. Or you disagree with that?
We're going on year 3 of this war. In February, that'll be the 3-year anniversary. And the Russians have advanced towards the city of Pokrovsk from their starting point about 30 kilometers. 30 kilometers advancing after hundreds of thousands of casualties in 3 years of war. Okay, yeah, they're taking wheat fields, they're taking tree lines, they're taking small villages. I hate map updates. It doesn't make any sense to me to talk about this. These are all inconsequential. I understand for Ukrainians who are fighting and dying, every square inch of their sovereign territory matters. But when you think about the swings in territorial changes, like in World War II or other large-scale wars in human history, this is a joke. What the Russians, with every advantage they had, have achieved. 30 kilometers advancing in the Donbass region towards Pokrovsk over 3 years. This is a joke. The Russians are embarrassing themselves. And it would be so easy if the Western alliance took this serious and gave Ukraine the weapons they needed to actually win this war. We can talk about why they haven't, but I push back on Russia being good at war and having achieved anything of value the last 3 years. I mean, the costs have far outweighed any potential future benefits that Putin is going to get from this war once it's frozen or over.
I think so. What about certain infrastructural targets? So, for example, the Russians have been damaging a reservoir of Kurakov, if I'm saying that right, and that could affect a lot of people in the Vuchta River, which in and of itself, if you've got then natural disasters or just crisis management to contend with, as well as a very, sort of relative fluid military situation, is that something that the Russians could do even more? Could they leverage just destructive methods that don't really play any way into sort of military calculation, just destroying for destroying's sake to try and accelerate it, especially in the run up to January 20th with Trump? Or they're not going to change their policy at this point?
There's no rules. I mean, who blew up the Novokakhovka Dam outside of Kherson? Obviously, it was the Russians. But why did they do it? Some say at the time it was to disrupt Ukraine's counteroffensive in Zaporizhia, which was kicking off at the same time, but there's no grand strategy. What Russia destroys, who they kill, what they do, it's just barbarism. There's no grand scheme. There's no grand architect masterminding this amazing victory for the Russians. They're barbarians. They're savages. They don't care about human life. They don't care about the environment. They don't care about preserving any infrastructure or buildings or anything of value. The goal is depopulation, just a blank slate, wipe everything clean. If they could scrape the entire surface of the earth with a knife and just strip everything away, they would. And then they would move in proper Russians loyal to the Tsar to repopulate the territory. This is what the Russians have been doing for 500 years.
Yeah, I recall visiting Kharkiv and the Oblast just after the liberation in late 2022 as part of a group research thing. And it was very interesting to see how the territory had been changed under the Russians and what they were trying to do by, as you say, the removal or sort of eradication of Ukrainian, symbolism, language, architecture, anything like that. And what we've seen those images, I think, of what Mariupol looks like now and other parts of the east that are controlled by the Kremlin. In your mind, if the Ukrainians were to begin to, I don't know, reclaim some of the territories, I'm not going to go too much into sort of endgame scenarios because I don't think it's valuable at this point. How could they sort of rekindle that? Or would the Russification be so well entrenched at this point that it's a very difficult thing to do?
Well, the propaganda has to stop. These people in the occupied territories are being force-fed propaganda. And if you can just cut that off, this is propaganda coming directly from the Kremlin. Sever that link and then start giving these people free information, and they'll naturally normalize. It is about economics. People instinctively said, am I better off now than before, or am I better off with them? Obviously, there will be crazy people who will always say that the Soviet Union was the greatest country that ever existed, and all we need to do is return to communism in the Soviet times, and then we'll live in bliss and harmony like we did when I was a child. Those people are nuts. We can ignore them. But for younger people, people looking to have kids, start a family, I think they've figured it out. I think they've figured it out that they're better off being closer to the EU, to having, labor rights, environmental protections, having a priority put on tax revenue going towards schools and hospitals rather than the military. This is the breaking point I keep waiting for people inside of Russia. Why do they tolerate crumbling schools and dilapidated hospitals and failing infrastructure? All of their tax revenue, the only focus of their government is on the military to expand, to reconstitute their glory days. So your point, if Ukraine goes into these territories and gets them back, one, you have to expel anybody that moved there that wasn't originally a Ukrainian citizen. Those people need to go back to Russia. Mm-hmm. But for the native-born Ukrainians that have been Russified, there's, going to be a period of de-Russification, de-Putinization needs to occur for these people to become productive, contributing members to a future Ukraine that will be closer to the European Union.
Do you think that I'll put it this way, right? So the reason why it's quite simple that I think a lot of Russians don't have more opposition to the war is because they just don't know any better. You can talk about the mentality of rural Russians, particularly if you want, but I think were there to be a scenario where the honeymoon period of the Russian economy, which is growing exponentially well at the moment, it's shown resilience to the sanctions at least, is because of the, as you said, investment in the military. But that's not sustainable. And ultimately, that doesn't yield the sort of longer term benefits. It doesn't have a spillover effect. It doesn't spill over into other industries that can benefit it from very well. So what point do you think that the Russian people would be like, okay, this is getting a bit ridiculous now. We're not seeing the benefits, right? I'm not talking about that they're going to overthrow Putin. I'm not one of these sort of, ridiculous channels on YouTube. Is there any chance of that? Any degree of internal pressure? It doesn't matter at this point. More is going to come from outside.
The best thing that a Russian person can do if they're unhappy with their government is leave Russia if they can. If you have language skills, technology skills, any kind of engineering skills, and you can get a visa to get out of the country, just leave. Stop paying taxes, stop contributing. To people who are still hoping that somehow the system could fix itself or normalize, I think Putin's rigged re-election last May was the end of that. Putin's never leaving office. And everyone in Russia has to know this by now. They have to realize this. And Putin is now presiding over a dying empire. The Russian Federation is not a coherent state. Like, it is a multicultural empire. That's how they describe themselves. 200 cultures, 200 language across Siberia, Central Asia, and the Caucasus or whatever. So these are fractured people unified by a language that was forced on them. A lot of their own unique cultural identity has been erased. So will it ever get better? And you can look at the demographics and the answer is no. Based on the birth rates, the declining population, and now this stupid war wiping out an entire young generation of men, an equal number fleeing, going to Turkey and Georgia and Thailand and the UK if they can get in. It's going to be horrific. this slow motion car crash, even if the war was frozen today and the fighting somehow miraculously stopped, it's still a slow motion car wreck that we're all going to be watching over the next 10, 20, or 30 years. Lots of developed countries have the exact same problem, but it's how do you deal with it? How are you going to manage declining birth rates, shrinking populations, shrinking economies? And you're right. All the tax revenue being spent on tanks and bombs and planes that are shot down and blown up, it adds nothing to the economy. It just makes them weaker and hastens a cataclysmic end that will come someday for the Russian people. They're never going to rebound from this when you think about, the long arc of time.
Yeah, and I guess that kind of, to put the same question, but on the other side of Ukraine, could you not foresee a potential scenario? Because there are a lot of Ukrainians across Europe now, and from my time of traveling around, be it for professional or leisure purposes, what I see is quite a variance of opinion. There are some Ukrainians who are, should we say, more indifferent to the long-term outcome. Some of them think, well, if the parts of the country that are controlled are, taken or absorbed by Moscow, and at least we have Ukraine, and that becomes heavily securitized and supported by the West, then that's, the best potential outcome. Then there are others which are much more strongly like, no, Ukraine must be able to exist in its sovereignty of the 1991 borders, including Crimea. But, I don't know, how do you feel about this? Could there be a case where maybe parts of Western Ukraine, which are not as affected, of course they're affected to a degree, they maybe are less worried or bothered about Eastern Ukraine being as part as it once was, and they just want the overall country to function and to exist in as best it can? How do you feel about that point?
There's security experts both in the United States and Europe who are just resigning that Russia's not going to collapse in the next 2 years, and Putin is going to die of old age at some point, comfortably in his warm bed. So a lot of people in the security community are saying, stop the killing, stop the fighting on both sides, freeze the conflict, and then just wait 20 years for Putin to die. And maybe in 20 years, we can get some kind of revolution comparable to the Berlin Wall coming down, and we can reunite Western Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine. That's a very rosy picture. That's very optimistic, and that kicks the can down the road for future politicians to find a solution. But yes, technically that is an option. Freeze the conflict, never internationally recognize the territory that Russia took, never give them that legitimacy in international bodies, and then just wait for Putin to die and hope there's some kind of revolution in Russia in which Ukraine will be reunited with their lost territories. I don't say I buy into that, but that's what a lot of people are proposing because it absolves them of any responsibility to fix the situation now.
Yeah, and to think about what future scenarios could be, well, we're going to touch upon those in part 2. It's been part 1, guys. See you soon.